kids and always been good at it. So for my presentation today, I'm going to treat you all like children, and I'm going to read you one of my favorite stories. So it is called A Public Ally Carol. I think it's by Carlos Dickens or something like that. And this story relates to me in ways like, I could go on talking about what I did this 10 months, but I want to really express what I've learned. So I just really relate to the character in the story significantly. And so the first stage of the story. It was the evening before the big holiday. Santiago walked past the Wadsworth Athenaeum and cut through Bushnell Park. It began to snow and streetlights were turning on. Walking around downtown depressed him more than anything. See, Santiago was born and raised in the city of Hartford. He went to public schools and played in public parks. Yet as an adult, he wanted nothing more than to escape the city. On his way home from the gym, Santiago ran into Fred, someone who he thinks was like a second, third, or distant cousin or relative of some kind. That didn't matter to him. Fred spent most of his time at the local community center where youth from around the neighborhood would go for tutoring and mentorship. A much better way to spend their time than on the streets or at home playing video games. Santiago, how are you? Happy holidays, said Fred. Meh, replied Santiago. Hey, tomorrow we're serving a big holiday lunch at the center for the kids. You should come by. Tim keeps asking for you. Old Santiago said he had to work and didn't have time, which was true. He was scheduled to work that holiday, but that was entirely his choice, as his supervisors made it optional. With ease, he came up with some other excuse to cut that conversation short as if it never happened. When he got to his desolate home, he dropped his bag and hung his coat. Midnight snuck up on Santiago like a ninja and revealed itself in the form of those late-night infomercials, something about the PAC system. He turned off the television at once and made his way to bed. Suddenly, the windows flung open. A gust of wind entered the room. Santiago closed the windows, but in the silence, he felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly. Standing there in the dark, just barely recognizable, was an old friend he grew up with, Jake Marley. It was the anniversary of Jake's passing, something Santiago neglected to recall. Jake wore heavy chains, reminiscent of the ones Run DMC and Slick Rick wore in the 80s. I must be dreaming, said the shaky Santiago. The ghost of Jake assured him that his eyes did not deceive. He was there with a message. In the afterlife, Jake carried the burden of roaming the earth, never to find happiness. His time among the living was spent being a go-getter, selfish, arrogant, and materialistic, taking for granted the relationships he could have built upon, and seeing success as the amount of money one earns. Jake never made a significant impact on the world during his never-ending rat race. He warned Santiago that he must change his ways in order to avoid the same fate. You're going to have 3 more visitors this night, he said to Santiago before disappearing. Second stave. Santiago tried to go back to bed, still hoping that it was just a wild nightmare. But then the windows bursted open again. This time, when he attempted to close them, an arm grabbed his and yanked him out of the building. They hovered 10 stories above street level. This winged figure was the ghost of all things past. She claimed to have a deep understanding of the self. In the living, she was known as Myers-Briggs. The spectre showed Santiago visions of his childhood. She detailed traits of his personality that drive his motivations currently and that were prevalent as a youth, such as being an introverted thinker. As a child, you seemed to find solace in self-expression through illustration and writing. You would spend hours in your room expressing yourself artistically and relished in being challenged. Did normal schoolwork bore you? Inquired the ghost. You weren't a terrible student. You always just seemed to get by. Santiago reluctantly replied, I only wish there were more alternative means of learning. I don't know why I was so easily distracted. He watched as the Myers-Briggs ghost took him through elementary all the way to high school and college. Santiago reacted with, see, throughout middle school and high school, they didn't properly prepare me for college. They set you up for failure unless you're one of those overachievers. Those were the kids that got all the attention. I know I could have tried harder. but I don't feel like my failure to finish school was mine alone to carry. She said, if there are things about the public education system you disagree with, have you ever thought of getting active and taking a stand to change them? Or perhaps your frustrations shouldn't be so one-sided. With that, she dropped Santiago on the ground and flew off with a wave and a smile. Third stave. Santiago found himself at Columbus Park in the South End, a park he played in a lot during his childhood. A vehicle drove up and the passenger door opened, revealing what clearly must have been the next of the 3 visitors he was forewarned about. Get in the car, let's do some community mapping, the spirit said with a smirk. I've got some sights to show you. Santiago defensively replied, community mapping? What community? I have watched this city take a turn more ghostly than you are. As a kid, I watched families that I was close to move out of here because they could afford it. They didn't waste their time trying to find the good in this divided town. Why should I? At some point growing up, he not only lost faith in his community, he lost its very definition. The ghost just stared, waiting for him to get in the car. Fine, I'll play along, Santiago said as he sat down and buckled his seatbelt. Cruising along the streets, Santiago studied the strange spirit. He even attempted a bit of small talk to kind of get a feel of who this person was. This ghost presented himself as being a friendly community advocate, an ally to the public, a merry corpse. They drove up the street that the distant relative Fred lived on and peered through his windows. While everyone was sleeping, in the middle of the night, Fred was still awake. He was working at his desk writing grant applications for that youth center, which was in dire need of funding. You see, the ghost spoke, there are people out there that care enough to devote hours of their time working towards solutions. You have no excuse not to do the same. For example, you work so well with children and limit yourself to being a swim instructor. There's so much potential in you to harness your talents in ways that may seem intimidating initially, but I challenge you to assert yourself and step outside of your comfort zone. Fred's apartment was only the first on their little ride. The rolled-up windows became like movie screens, and the gas pedal was the film projector. The more they accelerated, the more images materialized before them. Santiago didn't know how the ghost was even steering at that point. As it went faster, he was distracted by scenes of a nonprofit organization working within a school. Their mission advocated for academics, healthy lifestyles, and college-bound minds at earlier stages of childhood. This was something Santiago had never seen before. Other things he saw were young professionals holding a community conversation, asking for the needs of the people they intended to serve. They stressed that they do not mean to fix the community, but rather focus on what they can do to support it by highlighting its assets. Santiago glanced at the speed dial and saw it rose above 100 miles per hour before seeing one last scene in the windows. He saw school classrooms with computers engaging kids in special learning programs designed for those who may need a little extra support. He saw literacy initiatives that incentivized the students' desires to read. He saw teachers that were truly invested in their students' academic achievements on an individual level. He saw hope. The car came to an abrupt stop. The ghost held the passenger door open for Santiago and shook his hand goodbye. Fourth stave. Santiago arrived back in front of his doorsteps as ghost number 2 drove away into the darkness of the night. It was raining on top of the snow, creating slush on the sidewalk. As he moved slowly towards the stairs, he began reflecting on his life choices, and his negative biases. Before reaching the door, he heard a few small steps behind him. He was prepared for whatever was next, or so he thought. This final visitor was only 3.5 feet tall, a child wearing a black hooded sweater, jeans, and sneakers. The child's face was unclear and did not utter a single word. All this mute child did was take Santiago by the hand and walk him up the block. They walked and walked until the neighborhood was unfamiliar. The rain came down harder. They ended up at a cemetery. After walking past many graves, suddenly before him was a tombstone with his own name across it. Here lies Santiago. Whatever. Much like earlier, he was then shown visions, this time of a possible future. He saw himself selling things, being fake to people, and searching for fulfillment only to never truly obtain satisfaction, much like his friend Jake. It was then that he realized his negative perception of the city was simply a projection of what he had become. He knew he had to make a change. He had to let go of his reluctance to ask for help, seek answers, and serve a greater purpose. He could no longer let insecurities hold him back. He must own up to his struggles and be true to himself. He could not bear the thought of growing old and not leaving some kind of impact, big or small. He didn't want to keep pointing fingers at himself nor circumstance. He wanted to change his future. Then everything went black. Fifth stave. Santiago awoke with a new sense of purpose, a renewed sense of purpose. He finally understood that he is not an island. He needed to effectively communicate in order to successfully work with others. From that point on, he would hold himself accountable by recognizing his own strengths and that of his peers. He would need to own up to challenges and be willing to accept feedback. He vowed to embrace opportunities around youth development. There was a drive inside him to be an advocate for better health, academics, and encouraging inner city youth to have higher education in the forefront of their minds. The first thing Santiago did was go to the youth center to help Fred with the holiday lunch. The children were all glad to see him, especially Tim. It was a festive event. There, he also met up with his team of allies who shared his commitment to service. Together, they would go on to implement a 6-week leadership program for youth. Santiago had gained something that no level of education can teach. And that, my friends, is a better understanding of leadership, community, and change. Yeah.